demonstration, but before I do, I got a tweet from Left Lyre, the Nottingham Literature magazine, yesterday, and they referred to Jonathan Maria Simon and I as the Ocean's Four of the literary world, so I was very pleased with that. So I'm launching my book, The Descent of the Lyre. It's available upstairs, as all the books are. It's a book set in 19th century Bulgaria, Vienna and Paris. It's about music, about violence, about the guitar, and about banditry, and about all kinds of other things aside. Oh, sainthood. So I'm going to read 3 very short sections. The music was already there before he was born. He lay in his mother's womb and listened to her heart thud like a tupan. His eyes were closed, but his ears attuned to the rhythms of his mother's body, the unsteady rutchanitsas of her laughter, the slowing and quickening kopanitsas of her changing mood, the steady pravo horo of the hours she spent weaving at the loom. The music was there, as if waiting his arrival, lying in ambush for him as he made his way down the road that led into existence. The music was already there, not only before his birth, but before his conception. For his uncle, his mother's brother, had been a musician. His name also was Ivan. And he plucked the strings of the tambura with such sweetness it was said to bring peace to the animals of the forest, to calm the hearts of bears and wolves, so they would lumber away and cause nobody any harm. Like Orpheus, the old women of the village said, like Orpheus who had once been king. But Uncle Ivan had killed himself in the spring before the child's birth, whilst his nephew swam no larger than the length of a human thumb in the many rhythms of his mother's womb. They found the body hanging from a cherry tree, drenched in the rain of yellow blossom. When the fruits budded and swelled later that year, they were more abundant than anyone could remember. And nobody asked why Uncle Ivan took his life. For in times such as these, when the countryside was full of robber bands who would cut a man's throat for a few coins, when Sultan Selim III sat uneasily on his throne, listening to a million insects gnawing at the foundations of his empire, when those who toiled for a living on the hillsides were at the mercy of the rich, as they always are and always have been, in times such as these, what requires explanation is not why a man should wish to die, but rather why life persists at all. The child, no more than 7 or 8, brought the news of the suicide. Wandering on the hillside, he'd seen the man's body hanging from the tree, and he ran to the village in tears. The dead man's sister, on hearing the news, touched her hand to her belly, retired to the house and closed the door. Through her tears, she murmured blessings upon the child, and the child, shut in the singing, pulsing cauldron of her womb, listened as she sang her brother's name over and over, 2 syllables, the second stressed like the uneven steps of a dance. Ivan, Ivan, Ivan. So that's the opening section of the book. Ivan later grows up in the village of Gela, the home actually of Orpheus, according to the Bulgarians. Other people claim him. And the story follows Ivan's strange life from Bulgaria to Vienna to Paris. And the next section I'm going to read is another very short section, which is about the abduction of Ivan's bride when he's around the age of 17 from the village of Gela. The horsemen make their way silently through the trees. There are 31 of them in all, armed with guns and with swords sheathed in their belts. Their faces are lit only by the faint light of a half moon. They wear turbans on their heads, and on their faces are expressions of twitching vigilance. At their head is a rider so large that his horse sways uncomfortably and every so often stumbles beneath him, sending stones skittering down the slopes of the mountain. He sweats a little. The moonlight and sheen of sweat make him look as feverish as a ghost from the marshes. The horses emerge from the fringes of the forest and look down on the silent village. The large man squints into the darkness but can see nothing. Then he notices a ribbon of smoke that blots out the stars. There, in the heart of the village, the girl is sleeping. He turns to the troops. 3 of you, he says, remain with me on the ridge. The rest, head down to the village. Bring her back to me. They mount the ridge of the hill, the dark forest behind them. The village waits as if it knows what is coming. Then the raiding party, 27 well-armed men, spur their horses and clatter down the hill, sending small avalanches of stone and mud before them. The fat man, he is the son of the Pasha and has seen the girl many times, coming and going from the well, adjusts his weight in the saddle. Lights appear in the village, then shouts. Men are rising from their beds, snatching guns from beside their pillows. Women are taking up pokers, kitchen knives, scythes, should they need to defend their virtue. Dogs, waking from dreams in which they finally meet those rivals from across the valley who always bark last, leap to their feet, draw back their lips, snarling and yelping. The 27 horses are close to the village now. The Pasha's son waits on the ridge with his guard, immobile, pale, silent. There's a shudder of gunfire, shots loosed in the air. The horses gallop across the bridge, over the stream, into the village. Then there is silence. The horses have stopped in the village square. A man dismounts. He walks slowly to the door of a house, and there, outside the door, he waits. From inside, he can hear the voices of women. I wish to harm nobody, he calls. We have come only for the bride. And the final section I'm going to read is much later. So Ivan, with his bride taken from him, takes to the hills and he becomes a haidut, a bandit, wreaking his vengeance upon upon all the sundry. And at some stage they manage to pick up a Jewish guitarist who is travelling from Vienna to Constantinople, where he's going to play for the Sultan, who at that time was instituting reforms and westernisation of music in the Ottoman Empire. So Solomon has just been kidnapped by Ivan and the rest of his bandits, by this young man whose bride was taken from him several years before. He's, all of his Solomon's fellow travellers have been killed, and he's there with his guitar, and he's been offered a wager to play the guitar so sweetly that it might ease the suffering of Ivan the bandit's heart. Solomon placed the guitar in his lap. He wrapped his arms about it and closed his eyes. The world was pitching and reeling like a ship. Solomon is also very drunk, by the way. Ivan Voivoda muttered something else, and this time Asen, the translator, did translate. The Voivod asks you to play. He asks you to play to ease his suffering heart. Solomon ran his fingers along the strings. His pale right hand hovered over the sound hole. His left crouched on the fingerboard. He paused, testing the tuning, and made what adjustments he could. But because of the drink, it was hard to be sure whether he was making things better or worse. And he played an E minor chord that set the 4 open strings thrumming just to test the sound. He ran through another few chords, then he looked into the fire. What can a man play to save his life? He simply let his fingers guide him. He played the lightest of passages and harmonics, echoed them along the bass strings, playing in heavy rest strokes with his thumb, a melody that came to him from nowhere, or perhaps everywhere, from the long road he had travelled, from his regret at leaving Clara, from the fear that was settling in his belly, coiled like a guard dog half asleep, from these hillsides with their gorges and valleys, and upland meadows and rushing streams filled with trout and fringed by green ferns, from the music he had heard played in the houses of the peasants along the way, from the sky above with its incomprehensible stars, and the eyes of the men who sat listening to him, immobile, no longer even passing around the rakia, but simply listening. The melody inched its way up the stave, fugue-like, repeating each time, never quite the same, a melody like the river that, as some sage once said, one can never step into twice. There were waterfalls of arpeggios, swirling whirlpools of triplets, slow-moving depths of the lower strings, clashes partially resolved before becoming still further clashes. dissonances, tensions, cross rhythms that built upon each other until Solomon's hands were a blur. But somehow out of this chaos of notes, the same melody returned again and again. Then his hand slowed, his left hand moved up to the top of the fingerboard, and the melody appeared once more, modulating into the minor key with such extraordinary sweetness that, had he still been walking in those hills, had he not been torn to pieces by the savage women as a punishment for spurning their advances, even Orpheus himself would have wept to hear it. Solomon pulled the melody from the guitar in long skeins, drawing it out like silk. The tempo quickened again. The discords became more pronounced. Rhythms of the soil and the rocks and the trees, uncountable rhythms felt only in the body, beginning to take over. The bagpipe player smiled and leaned forward. He had heard nothing like this before, and yet it was as if he had always been waiting to hear it. His fingers twitched, following the flood of ornaments and grace notes. Asen, the translator, leaned back, breathless. Boyko, the standard bearer, put his face in his hands. For what reason, it is impossible to tell. And Solomon played on as the sparks flew up into the night, and the dead on the hillsides, unseen, clustered round to listen. Because it's not every day that you get a chance to hear a concert such as this, and if the dead are not easily roused, well, they're not entirely intractable. And as the dead assembled, although they could not be seen, the Haiduti shivered at their presence, and at the strange spell Solomon was weaving, not a music of the head nor of the heart, but of the hands, that danced like ghosts in the firelight, the hands and the body and the ancient earth singing through the body and the sinews and the blood. Then the melody eased and became simple, played on the bass strings, echoed in the higher register, again more gently in the bass, again at the top of the guitar in harmonics, clear, pure as a mountain spring. The final note so quiet, it was not certain whether it was played or simply imagined. Solomon opened his eyes. His head was pounding and he was damp with sweat. He looked around the fire. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. Then he saw Ivan Voivoda, and tears were streaming down the man's face. The voivod, Ivan, rolled his shoulders and cleared his throat. His men turned and looked at him with astonishment, for they had never once seen him weep. Then Ivan let his head hang, so the tears fell into his lap. His verdict, murmured so softly, it was almost inaudible. The Jew lives. Thank you very much.